up so I can just put it in the chat box so I know. Okay. So a little housekeeping as we get started on our session on leading for anti-racism and equity, data-informed decision-making. Thank you all for joining us today. We are so excited to talk to you about concrete strategies for making data-informed decision-making. If you want to chat to everyone, be sure to click in the chat box to everyone instead of the host and panelists if you want everyone to hear your comments. So whenever we present, we like to start with the land and labor acknowledgement in solidarity, first and foremost, to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And we know there is an ongoing journey in order to have proper reparations and the return of land to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so we want to be in solidarity by owning the fact that we're standing on lands that were tilled and honed by people before us. We also like to give a labor acknowledgement, an acknowledgement to the enslaved peoples of Africa who were brought here against their will, but whose very beings and existence created the financial institutions, the higher ed institutions, the backbone of this country, whose names we will never be able to say thank you, of which we are still in the plight for reparations. So as we go into a moment to center our souls and share with you the Indigenous lands that our founding company sits on in Chicago, we invite you to still yourself for this 1-minute sound meditation, while also pouring out the energy not only to our ancestors, but to those around you. Okay. My sound did not come through, but you saw the gong. I hope you imagined it in your spirit that the sound of the sound meditation was coming through. We'll make sure we include the link. So our session outcomes for our time together, I'm not going to read through all of these for you, but the key thing I want you to know is that when you leave this webinar, you will have what we like to say in developing capacity blueprints. Dr. Heiser and I will walk you through a 3-step process. So whether or not you have a Dr. Heiser Senior Impact Advisor or a CEO or a company based in equity and inclusion, you will be able to make data-informed decisions based on what we share with you. And you will also see new ways of using your power and your choice in every situation. Our mission at Developing Capacity Coaching at the baseline level is that we coach people to trust themselves to lead for equity and justice at work, in their families, and within their communities. What's our hope for the world is that every day when people wake up, they would think about how can I use my power and choice in whatever environment I'm in, at work, at home, or in my family, to create an environment where everyone can have full and equal opportunity to benefit from the resources in my organization, community, or world. Our focus is on how do we help people get unstuck and overcome obstacles that's preventing them from being able to lead for equity and justice at work, at home, and within their communities. And the core thing we want to anchor you on before we hop into the meat of our session today is that the capacity to lead for anti-racism, which is one form of equity, there's multiple forms of equity, anti-Semitism, trying to eliminate patriarchy, trying to eliminate xenophobia, i.e. fear of the foreign. We're going to lean in race today, but the capacity to lead for anti-racism requires you to be data informed. But the thing we want to share is that we as humans walk around every day making data-informed decisions. So we want to break it down to that basic level. You all use data in order to decide whether or not you were going to spend today with us. You might have looked at our website. Someone may have forwarded you the information for the webinar. You may follow us on LinkedIn or Instagram. So we are programmed to look at the world around us and use that information to discern how we want to move in a given space. What Dr. Heiser and I are doing today is we're going to talk to you about how do you be more conscious of that? How do you use that information in order to create actual change? How do you not get stuck after you have the data? And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Heiser, who will talk to you a little bit about our overarching strategy for ADA before we get into it.
Hello, everyone. So I want to just briefly give a shout out. I see former UNC colleagues. I see Karen Stokes-Chapeau. I see my Grand Challenges humans and people that we have partnered with here at DCC. We're just really glad that you're here. And we know there's a lot of ways you could spend your time over the lunch hour, and you chose to spend it this way. So thank you. That makes you partners in this work already. And it's really exciting to see you all. So one of the things is that Annice and I have both had this journey towards this idea of how do we use data to drive decisions, to inform our steps towards advancing equity. And so we both are at this point of being data-informed decision makers in our careers and in our worlds, but our paths and our journeys to that point were different. Dr. Fisher took this path of becoming an expert in equity and inclusion work. And I took this path of like, I need to be a data expert. I need to understand data. I need to leverage data to help organizations make change. And so today, what we want to do is share both of those perspectives with you, but we also want to share the intersection of those perspectives. So when we're thinking about equity mindsets, we're thinking about a focus on a belief and a desire to advance equity, to make interventions and be brave and take risks to disrupt inequity. We're thinking about asking for help when we need it, and we're thinking about how we collaborate with partners to end injustices. At DCC, we talk about those mindsets, but we have this layer of how do we cultivate these mindsets through coaching, healing, and love, because that's how we try to approach all of our work. When we think about a data mindset, we're focusing on how do we use information to foster change, specifically advancing equity. Data mindsets, these are your curious people. These are people asking a lot of questions. And data is viewed as like information and stories, but also a reflection of the voices of those that we are working to serve. And so over the years, like I said, we've taken different paths, but now we're both here at this intersection of using data to inform changes to advance equity. So on our next slide, we have a very clear, simple framework that we wanted to give you, and it is ask, disaggregate, and act. And this is really just a framework that you can adopt when you are working to make data-informed decisions. Again, just to reiterate, you don't need to be a data specialist to do this. You don't need to be an equity specialist to do this. This is just someone, you're just out here trying to do some good in the world and trying to make sure that we're ending any harm that's being caused. And so this framework, we're going to be thinking about what questions do you need to ask from an equity perspective and a data perspective? What considerations do you need to make when you're disaggregating data? And what are some actions for equity that you can take today?
So I'm going to get us started with the first step in our A, which is to ask questions to raise consciousness. And the big thing we want to say here is that, we begin and end this protocol with an action piece to it, but also this is about how do you take intentional steps to exercise conscious leadership for equity that actually matters and creates constructive change. And in order to do that, you have to raise your consciousness and have a clear understanding of what equity and anti-racism means, and then also to be able to be bold and brave and ask yourself the question, are we living it? So we're going to share with you our definition of racial equity and the question that we ask all of our partners. We teach this to every person, whether you're an organization or come in one-on-one coaching. We ask the question, does every member of my organization, regardless of their race, have full and equal access to participate in and benefit from the resources in our organization? That is that first question you have to ask with consciousness. If you have racial disparities, my friends, the answer to that question is no, because that means that I can draw a color line as to whether or not someone has full access. Full access means there's no barriers to entry. Equal access means that if I'm white, a person of color, a person of Arab descent, I still will be able to enter into the space. And it's not just about access too. Folks have to be able to participate in and also benefit from the resources in your organization. That's the primary question. The last thing I'll say here is that in order to really achieve this question, you have to be willing to disrupt, right? You have to be willing to disrupt for the sake of diversity, which means you have to be willing to say, we're going to be going after eliminating any race-based experiences. You have to dismantle for inclusion, which means we have to directly address inequities that marginalize people of color. When you have a racial disparity, I'll get into that later about how that actually creates systemic challenges. I'm going to go there. When I get moving with the spirit, I just go, but let me walk myself back. And then the third thing is you have to be willing to rebuild with stakeholders. So I'm going to be walking you through the ADA, thinking about how you do these three things. The last thing I'll say on this slide is racial equity is sustained by consistency and accountability. My friends, you have to invite it to the table. You have to dine with it. You have to engage in it. Racial equity does not like, boom, come and appear to you. But this question and the honest answer to this question is critical to you being able to exercise leadership for equity. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Heiser, who's going to give you more of a data-informed perspective.
So when we're thinking about questions that we want to ask from a data perspective, the first thing we always want to know is, where does our data come from and what lived experiences and identities does this data reflect? So when we're thinking about where our data comes from, it's the third bullet point here, we're thinking about what are we getting at here, and what we're getting at here is the integrity of the data, the quality of the information. This is always something that we are thinking about, whether we are trying to make small programmatic adjustments or whether we are making multi-million-dollar investments. We want to be thinking about the quality of information, where it comes from, how it's collected. When we're thinking about lived experiences, we want to be thinking about the fact that when we wake up in the morning, we walk through this life with our experiences behind us, with our worldview with us. It's the lens through which we see and understand things. So it is very easy to look at information and think to yourself and envision to yourself that the people responding look like you, right? That they're walking through life the same way you are. And when we really think critically, when we're thinking about the intersections of data and equity, we want to get clear on who our data reflects rather than lay our own lens on top of it. So we want to be thinking here about decentering whiteness. We want to be thinking about data as information. It can be numbers and stories, but it's really an opportunity to hear the voices and the experiences of those who provided it. So we want to make sure to develop an understanding of who is reflected before we draw conclusions. We also want to think about two more questions, but we'll talk about them more in detail in our next sections, but I'll give you a preview. What's the data tell us, and how might we use this data to create more access by Dr. Fisher's definition of equity, or a better experience for all?
As we bridge our transition, the key thing we want you to be thinking about is that you have to know where you are in order to be able to effectively overcome whatever obstacles you may be facing within your organization so that you can create a sustainable plan for equity. We will drop a handout at the end of this talk that will have the ADA and all the questions for those folks who are writing very quickly to capture everything that we say. We will drop a PDF. The second thing you have to be able to do is to be willing to disaggregate and differentiate. And for us, it's a set of practices in order to be able to do that. And the key thing here is that you can't just ask the question. What are the experiences of people of race in our organization? You have to actually be willing to address the demographic differences. One question that we teach everyone, the question is, are there race-based systems of advantage or disadvantage operating within the structure that creates inequity? So we're going a little bit deeper. We're asking a global question. And we put a slash there for identity-based systems because sometimes your race might not be the area that you're focusing in on. But it's that simple question. Are there race-based systems of advantage or disadvantage, disparities operating within this structure? And I'm going to tell you why we specifically use the term systems of advantage or disadvantage. Where you have disparities in your organization, you have a race-based system of advantage where white folks are beneficiaries of bias at the expense of people of color's marginalization. And so I know that might be hard to hear for people, but that's what's actually happening. So when you go in and you disaggregate that data and we begin to ask this question, where is it operating in this structure? Where is it operating in this policy? Where is this operating in this process? I'm going to give you an example of how we ready leaders' mindset. Because if we don't have the honest truth, it's going to be very hard for us to move forward and actually make change. I noticed that there are a couple of mayors in this session. I did a session with mayors in January in DC. And one of the things I said to them, because people sometimes get overwhelmed at this question because they're like, it's so much, I don't know what to do. And here's what I say to them. You must pick your one thing at a time to address change to make sure that it's manageable. So none of us in this session created every structural inequity that exists. And for them, I said in your city. But it is your job to chip away at the issues and pick what you're going to focus on. So that's why we said within this structure. So for you, it might be your admissions process. It might be in your hiring process. It might be your employee training and development. Where is it operating in this particular structure? And what is the one thing that I'm going to do to focus on that? Because that's where you begin to create your differentiated experience as a result of you disaggregating the data. Y'all following us? If you are, put a thumbs up in the chat box so we know that you are with us. We have a lot of juicy stuff here, so we want to make sure we get through it. So I want to see the chat box being lit up with thumbs up if you are following us. Put a sideways thumbs if you are not and you have a question, drop it in the chat box for us. Thank y'all.
So we're going to talk a little bit now about disaggregating data from the data perspective. So beyond understanding who's reflected in our data, disaggregating the information allows you to see trends and experiences within and across racial groups. So you want to consider the demographic data that you truly need to create impact with your program or service. If you're thinking about racial equity, you want to collect that data related to race in an ethical and culturally appropriate way. So it's important to consider what demographic data you need and will use. And I say this because oftentimes our curiosity gets the better of us and we just start dropping 47 demographic questions into our surveys, or sometimes a phrase that's lethal when you're collecting data is, it'd be nice to know. Great, but for every question that we ask, are we honoring the time and the energy and the talent of the person who is giving us that information? So if you don't have a plan for how you're going to use that information, just pause on it. Wait, you can always ask it later. So just really focus on one or two demographic questions, because every demographic question that you add to your instrument exponentially increases the amount of data that you have to consider. If you're going to ask a question about race, you now have every question on your instrument by each demographic racial group that you ask about, right? So just thinking about that. So if you're thinking about, I see a question that if it's what's causing differences by race or beyond our organization to the actual pipeline and system, thank you for that question. We're going to think about that for a couple of minutes and then hopefully get to it towards the end here. So one of the things we also want to think about is when you have large volumes of data, it can be really easy to get into that, some of my favorite stuff, that like really rich statistical analysis. But when we have small respondents in a population, how do we honor that information for what we're trying to do, maybe addressing inequities in a way that still keeps that response proportional to those who have shared their experience? So really take time to reflect on this. And a couple of things that we want you to think critically about is that when we're disaggregating data, the purpose is to seek to understand differences across racial groups without comparing to a standard of whiteness. We're not taking each race group and saying they're less than or greater than in their responses to our white population. We're trying to understand each group in its own experience. It's also really important to consider that groups individually are not monoliths, right? The 57 people in one demographic group who responded to your survey do not represent the entire culture at large. And sometimes, again, when we have really large response sets, we can get into and investigate those questions differently. But we want to just make sure that we're always keeping the heart of culture in mind when we're disaggregating our data. I'm going to back to you, Annice.
Dr. Deerdorf, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name right. If not, forgive me, charge it to the head and not the heart. I'm going to be answering your question right now. And I'm going to give an example of a partner that we work with that realized that the differences by race was not due to what they were doing. It was due to their people who were receiving funding from them. So I'll talk to you about how we help them navigate that. So listen up, perk up. So the last piece is, we want you to take action, and we want you to act with data-informed decision-making. What people always say is you're not going to leave Annice or Ciji or DCC without some 4-step, 3-step, 2-step blueprint, because we are about moving the work. So we want you to take action with the data and make data-informed decision-making. What do I mean by that? I mean is that you already will have collected a lot of information along the way. If you just ask the question I gave you, if you just ask one of the questions that Ciji gave you over these last two areas, you will have collected some information for you to begin to take action. But you have to be willing, and I'm going to say this again, you have to be willing to address the differences. You have to be willing to address it. And what you have to think about is we have the disparity. The data has shown that there is some differentiated experiences. Then you have to be thinking about, where do I need to build the capacity in order to address this? Is it a knowledge gap? So do we need to increase people's knowledge on what racial disparities look like in hiring, or what racial disparities look like in the classroom? Is it an awareness gap? That means we need to teach people how to recognize a microaggression, or how to recognize cultural oppression. Or is it a skill issue? Do we actually need to have role plays? Do we actually need to have the 4-step items that we give people to post in their area so they know how to address it? Sometimes it might be one of those 3 things, or maybe all of them. So we're doing some work with a school in Chicago, and they told us one of the most helpful things that they've been using with all of their teachers and all of their administrators is our 4-step consciousness raising process. That's the way they all respond. Now they have a common knowledge. So let me answer Dr. Deerdorf's question. She says, what if what's causing differences by race are beyond our organization or the actual pipeline or system? Then you have to begin to ask yourself, how do I rebuild or redesign to eliminate these inequities by engaging our stakeholders, or some people might call them collaborators? That's a great question, because sometimes it's not us, it's we are partnering with other people. And so I'm going to lift for you an example of us doing some work with a statewide agency. Okay, so they knew that there was inequity in the organizations that they were working with, because the data showed them that. They saw that there was racial disparities based on people who were participating in programs that were funded by their grants. So we took a multi-step approach. What did they do? They act with consciousness. They asked the question, is everyone having full and equal access to the money that we're dripping down on the ground? They disaggregated the data and was looking at the tough questions. So then what did that intervention look like? We started out with an on-the-ground capacity building summit with all of their grantees, where we focused in on raising their knowledge and awareness about how do you honor people's humanity in that particular functional area that they worked in. And I'm being, generic for a reason here to protect our clients' anonymity. And then we gave them a protocol that they could use with their teams at that summit to go back on the ground. Then we did the next layer of intervention, where we went to their local counties and we convened people And we went deeper. They shared with us all of their documents and the process, everything that they was using. And then Dr. Heiser and I were then able to look at their data on a local level and then teach them how to review their policies and processes, and then how to intervene on the local level to disrupt the racial inequity that was happening with people that they serve. So that's an example of how you can look at where is your lever? Where's your lever to build capacity? And if it's outside of your house, their lever was that they were a funding body, right? And so they had made a commitment to racial equity and justice. And that's how we intervene. So I hope that answered your question, Dr. Deardoff. Not shoot us an email and we can chit chat with you. But I hope this helped everyone to see how you can take the data and then begin to say, how am I going to address the demographic experiences? And then how do I engage stakeholders in that process? Now it's Dr. Heiser.
Hello. Some more fun stuff should pop up on this slide. I don't know if we have to hit some more buttons, but it's just a lovely graphic slide. So we wanted to give you a framework within a framework. It's very meta. Like, we couldn't help ourselves. So we want to think about, with acting with data and considering equity, we want you to focus on achieving change, right? And so to do this, pick 1 to 3 data points to focus on. You want to keep this manageable. It can get very exciting when you see a lot of information. It starts clicking for you and you're like, what about this? What about that? Do not make this like a terrible action movie plot line, all right? Just pick a couple of things and be like, let's keep it tight. Let's keep it focused. Then you want to co-create 2 or 3 action items with the individuals who will be most impacted by the change. So if there's a handful of people that you have in your circle and you can talk to them about, hey, we're thinking about making these changes. We're basing it on this information that was shared by hundreds of people. You just want to give us your feedback real quick. Are we on the right path? You will be surprised at how much people will be willing to weigh in and help you prioritize the action items you could take. This also keeps you focused from trying to do too many things at once, because if you do too many things, you won't be able to figure out which one worked, right? When you go back to see if the changes you were trying to instigate worked, if you had the impact you were hoping to have, you won't know what caused that impact if you throw 100 things to move your 100 ideas out there to move your couple of data points. You want another kind of caution here when you're picking your action items is that discussing the data and digging for more data are really important activities, but they are not going to advance equity. Focus your action items on what will create a different experience for your user population. And Annice and I were in a session and we had pulled all these mayors and all these data people and all and some attorneys. Like, we had pulled all these really amazing people into a room together to look at their data. And we heard one table, that table had a data person who was instantly like, and we could go look at it by this, and we could look at it like this, and we could get some more data. And I was like, yes, you can. But right now, you're going to focus on the data in front of you first, because collecting more data will not move the needle for the people you are trying to serve. So let's focus on, that is one of the biggest recommendations I think, focus on co-creating action items with what's in front of you right now. So then you want to tie each action to a person in a timeline. We spoke about this earlier with the accountability piece. This goes back to that. It is important to identify who's responsible for implementing the action item and when it should be done by. If we're in like an assessment, continuous improvement context, this is the point of the story or the process where I'm going to tell you that after you implement your 2 to 3 action items, you go back, you collect more data, and you see if you move the needle in the way that you were hoping.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Heiser, for that. We are the queens of the right now. We are the queens of coming back and focusing on this so that we can actually have measurable results. So I'm going to invite in Kathy Tan, who is our program operations consultant, and we are actually going to do question and answer. Let me stop sharing my screen. The key thing for you is Dr. Heiser and I will be answering questions that you submitted via the registration. So Kathy has gone through and collated those. We're going to do the best that we can to answer those. And then if you have additional ones, you can drop it in the chat box. And we'll also be dripping information from this webinar over the next couple of weeks so that you'll continue to get information. So with that, Kathy, you want to come off mute and get us going on some of these questions that folks have?
Yes. All right. Hello. Welcome, everyone. And I'm excited to moderate this panel with our experts, Dr. Heiser and Dr. Fisher. I know just me being program operations consultant, I'm learning so much from you all. So yeah, I'm excited to just dive into the questions. So if you all can just give us some inspiration of how you've seen the intersection of equity leadership capacity building and equity-based assessments work successfully in your experiences. And additionally, so it's a two-parter, how have you utilized data to differentiate between equality and equity?
I'll start with the last question first, and then I'll quickly answer so Dr. Heiser can answer. So you'll notice that I said equity. So equity is about fairness and justice, disrupting, dismantling, rebuilding. The DDR is what I like to call it. And then when I define equity, I put full and equal. So, right, something Dr. Nancy J. Evans said, who was my master's committee chair, she said, sometimes you have to do things that are unequal in order to achieve equity. Right. And so what that means is we don't enter the conversation by saying equal, because if we have disparities, there is no equal. Everyone's not getting equal access to benefit from whatever that resource is. Our goal is to get everyone to have equal access. But in order to do that, we must we must drive for equity, which means that we must be asking, do people have full and equal without any racial barriers? Can they participate and benefit in and out? What does it look like for a white person, a person of color, an ADAP, a woman, a person who immigrated here first generation? Okay, so that's the first part of there, while we don't conflate the two. And it's often a challenge when we're designing, because people who help us as outside contractors we have to say, no, it's not equality, it's equity. And then the second piece is, how do we bring people along? Everything we do is we use an organizational climate assessment. Assessment starts everything we do. If you're coming in one-on-one coaching, you're getting an intake assessment. If you're coming in as an organization, you're getting a climate assessment, whether it's modified or short. What the beauty has been about having Dr. Heiser in the house is that she has taken our original climate assessment, and she has taken it to another level, because she's like, oh, this is what you do in the leadership domain? Okay, let's add it. So I say all that to say that's the benefit of our partnership, is that we're able to come in and say, what's the lay of the land? If you don't have a Ciji or Annice, we have given you 3 sets of questions that you could use as your own climate assessment, because you take that lay of the land and then the baseline by which you are starting. And then you're able to say, okay, how am I going to address this? What am I going to do to move this forward? And I'll be quick in saying this. We did that with the school district. We literally took their climate assessment and took that data and did ADA. We developed a unique multi-pronged strategy for their board, their teachers, their administrators, their students, engaging stakeholders, their policies, their processes, and we helped them build an equity strategic plan. The beauty of it is now Dr. Heiser she's putting together this fabulous impact evaluation assessment for equity, and she's able to show how we took that initial assessment 2 years ago. Here's the intervention. Here's what happened after that intervention. Y'all can see I'm on fire. This is something I love. Okay, Dr. Heiser, turn it over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to give 3 examples that have nothing to do with me. So you heard how I like to work. This is why Annice and I are together, right? In the spirit and then in doing this work, because we both get very excited about it. So I want to give a couple of examples. The first one is an example on disaggregating data for programmatic engagement. So there's this program that was designed to engage students in the higher education context. And so we realized in disaggregating data that Indigenous American students were a group of students that had the least amount of data for. Now, I'm being very careful here. What I'm not saying is Indigenous students were less engaged than white students, right? I'm not saying that. So what I'm saying is, hey, maybe it's a systemic thing that we don't have enough information, or maybe we've missed the mark on how we're collecting this information for this population. But at any rate, let's just figure out what's going on. And so what we did was, and by we, let me be really, really clear. This was a program director. It's actually my partner at Western Michigan University, Evan Heiser, who led a program designed to engage every student. That was the mantra of this program. We will engage every student at this higher education institution. And so he hosted a meeting with an office that was focused on engaging students, and that office connected with the Indigenous American student leaders. They shared their challenges and their roadblocks, and together an action plan was created to address the challenges. The engagement numbers catapulted in 1 year. Okay, so that's one example of how we've seen this work. Here's another example that's a little bit different. It's still in that kind of like higher ed sphere, because this is where I just have a lot of applied examples. That's typically who I work the most with. And so one is housing demand, on-campus housing demand. And this is more of like a how we leverage the data to have impact in a different way. So we had a new building on campus that had not been at full occupancy. So we were very excited to spend a lot of money, built this building, but it was not full. Students were not choosing to live there. They were not as excited as we thought they would be. And so we wanted to fill this room. We had a problem we were trying to face. We want to fill this room. So what we did was we had options that were fully furnished. We had a lease that was more flexible for this room type. And so we looked at data that had already been collected from a benchmarking study to see how past students felt about living in the building. We disaggregated that data and we found out that international students loved it there. They didn't have to buy furniture. They loved that they didn't have to move furniture, and they loved that the lease was flexible so that they could travel back home and see their families for extended periods of time and come back and still have a consistent place to live. So we did some targeted marketing to international students. We explained the benefits. We talked about how past international residents felt about the building. That building reached 90+% occupancy for the first time that year. So it's another way to use data to solve a problem and meet a need. The last one I'll share with you is that I had a director of student judicial conduct who was really focused and aware and plugged into what was going on in our country around African-American and Black human beings and their interacting with the judicial system and the police context, right? The police system. And so she came into my office and she said, I want to make sure we're not replicating larger societal bias and racism in our university student conduct process. So, right, a microcosm, but that microcosm can replicate larger bias. And this is what she was concerned about. So we looked at all of the data, and what she wanted to know were things like, these are those questions, right? We talked about asking equity questions. Are Black students disproportionately more likely to be sent to conduct? Are they disproportionately more likely to be found responsible and have like a student record? Are they more likely to be given a more severe sanction, right? So we analyzed 5 years of data from the conduct process to answer those questions for her. We didn't collect one bit of new information. Nobody was designing any instruments. We used information we already had to kind of make sure or identify if there was bias in our process and our system so that we could be treating students more fairly. I think that's all the examples I have for now. Did I answer all of your questions, Kathy?
You did.
Okay.
So many of them. Thank you so much, Dr. Heiser and Dr. Fisher. For time's sake, we have one more question. And so I'm going to try to just wrap it into one. And to give some context too, if you all can really draw on your experiences, I know that, Dr. Fisher and Dr. Heiser, both, you have developed signature frameworks that highlight your approaches to equity work. So Dr. Heiser, if you can really draw on your experience, just in your assessment journey and your approach, and Dr. Fisher with your work with Conscious Leadership for Equity, that journey and approach to really give our attendees strategies that they can use to really, identify and bring others along in anti-racism, equity, data-informed decision-making work, stakeholders at all levels, and how to do so authentically.
Okay, I'm going to just hop in and ask us to be really tight when you go, Dr. Heiser, and I'll be tight because we do have 2 more things we want to say, and it's 12:41, and I want to be mindful of the time for folks. Okay,
perfect. So Dr. Heiser, if you could actually start us out.
Absolutely. So I will say, if we think about assessment as the process of clearly identifying or defining the impact you want to have, using outcomes, measuring that impact, analyzing the information, and using it for change, at the heart of that process, we usually have in organizations like mission, vision, values. And so I have worked over years with colleagues, some of whom are on this call, Hi, Beth. Hi, Joe. Thank you. Like to co-create this model that we call equity-centered assessment. All right. And this approach really positions assessment as a process and a product that you can leverage to advance equity. So when we think about equity-centered assessment, we're talking about like, how can I use this process to foster equity, to address issues of oppression and privilege, to make improvements and to reshape systems and structures that are influencing the environment in which I'm serving people. So I'm going to stop there because I could talk about this all day. And I'm just going to stop. We can talk more, reach out. We'll keep going. Back to Annice.
Thank you so much. I'll share a quick aside. Dr. Heiser and I have known each other for over 10 years. I actually hired her for her first assessment job outside at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So we always laugh and say we co-created the moment 10 years ago for us to come back together to work with one another on our journey. So I just had to share that. So that's probably why you see so much energy, because we've been in this together for 10 years. When I think about the Conscious Leadership for Equity journey and the approach, when I created this company and created Conscious Leadership for Equity as a framework, it was really based off my experiences of being an entrepreneur. So I was always charged as the person brought in to launch new initiatives, launch new strategies. One being assessment, in which I tapped a very bright Ciji Heiser to launch that area. And then, that involved change management. And it also involved a lot of coalition building and how do you pull people along? How do you mobilize people? That was one prong I was always working in, the change management space. The equity and justice space, I was just developing my own level of expertise and experiences going to SJTI and a number of other institutes presenting at NASPA and ACPA as a Black woman in the world wanting to make this space a better place for all. And then the third area I was focused in on was creating and developing leadership programs, curricula, and strategies. So Conscious Leadership for Equity is a merger of those three things: change management, equity and social justice, and leadership. Under this process, that in order to advance equity, it requires an exercise in conscious leadership. It requires people moving with a set of practices. And so part of that was I realized on my own journey when I had to launch an assessment area. And as I was doing my work, is that you always have to have some sort of information to inform what you are doing. And that's why we always include in our approach, there's always an assessment and evaluation piece. There's always a piece for coaching leaders so that we don't get in our own way, so that we work through the fear and doubt through consciousness raising. And then there's always a part on capacity building so that everyone in the organization is actually able to move this work. Everyone from, we train people in maintenance staff and front desk workers. Everyone has to be able to have an equity one-on-one perspective so that they can see how they can use their power and choice to bring solutions. So to sum all that up, coaching, capacity building, and assessment is what's truly needed in order to transform people, policies, and processes to be a more just organization. I'm going to drop for you all in the chat box a short survey for us to get your feedback on the session and also for us to be able to give you some additional information. So you'll have that in the chat box should you want to continue to engage us, should you want to continue to be a part of this work. If you give me 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, because we did play a little bit of music to start out, I will close us out with one additional slide here. So a lot of you posed a lot of questions to us that was related to like, how do I actually lead for equity? How do I take this information and do something? And part of what we're launching and developing capacity is our Conscious People for Equity course. And that course is going to help you be able to learn a lot of the practices that Dr. Heiser and I talked about today. How do you get over the fear and doubt? How do you handle resistance? How do you mobilize people? How do you take the data? And so this course will launch in the middle of May. When you complete that survey link, we will be able to reach out to you and you will get a pre-registration link to be able to enroll in that course. It's a self-paced online course over 3 modules where we're going to talk to you about leading for equity, how do you lead for change, and how do you do healing and reconciliation work. The last thing we are going to share, and this will be in a nice, fun email that we send to you when we are done with all the resources, is if you found what we were talking about helpful and you yourself want to get a snapshot of where your organization is with equity, we're offering 10% off the next 30 days for our Evaluate and Envision Equity program for organizations. And this really will walk you through some of the ADA. You'll get a abbreviated climate assessment. You'll get some capacity building with conscious leadership for equity, and then we'll set you up with an equity purpose to practice plan and invite you into our longitudinal assessment so we can be with you along the journey. 2 minutes over. I think we got it all in. We realized that we gave you here what could have been 3 different webinars, but we gave you it here. And so please know that you will get a follow-up email with us in 48 hours that will have this recording. You'll also have the ADA handout, and then follow us on LinkedIn and under Developing Capacity, and on Instagram at DCC for Equity, and you'll be able to continue to get information from us and drip with us. Let me see if there's, I know folks have to go, so please hop off, but I can wait, 5 more minutes in case anybody has any other questions. I don't know if Dr. Heiser, if you can hang around a little bit for the after party. And we can answer a few of those questions. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our coach affiliates who were here: Anthony Curtis, Brad Omechi, Rose Francois, Christine Rivera. Thank you to our UNC colleagues, Allison, I saw in there. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Ciji, for this session. And let me see, I think we have a Q&A. I think we have a Q&A question.
Hey, Annice, can you drop our social handles in the chat?
I can. That is our Instagram, and Developing Capacity Consulting is our LinkedIn.
Ooh. Luke just dropped a question about him.
Thank you for the opportunity and your time. Do you have recommendations on how to work through the tensions between step 2 and needs to uphold privacy? So disaggregation. Do you want to take this, Dr. Heiser, and I'll jump in?
Yeah, I think it can be helpful as an organization to create a threshold by which you don't report data underneath. So you'll see this in national studies quite a bit, where they'll say, like, if there's less than 20 people who've responded in a certain combination of demographics, so we don't report that to protect those individuals. So I think that that's one way to do that. And it helps if you co-create that so that everyone is aware that that's a safety mechanism that's in place. I'll also say that I know when we're doing things like data integration and dashboarding, that it's really important to have those unique identifiers. But when we're doing data disaggregation in general, we don't necessarily need to connect the information back to the individual. We can just have a couple of markers by which we want to understand our larger data sets. And so being really clear about that with people, having policies on that, it can be really important to help pave the way to do that a little more smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I guess the big thing I would add on is Dr. Heiser is very good at saying to people, we won't disaggregate to the point where we will identify people in your organization. So we ran an experiences survey for an organization that had a lot of racial tensions in the midst of polarization. So we knew that our work was a political act. And so we were very mindful about how that information was shared. And she and I tag team on how do you even deliver the information that doesn't out anybody in the process, but how do we deliver the truth? And that's where the partnership of us came in, with just being bold and honest, and the politics piece of it that I brought. And then Dr. Heiser said, okay, now how do we tell the real story? Somebody else dropped a question about how do you engage staff voluntarily if you don't have the demographic data and there are trust issues. And Dr. Heiser gave a recommendation about having a plan for the data so that people know that they can trust what they're giving you. The second thing that I built on is that if you have trust issues in your organization, then consider getting a trained, trusted party to lead focus groups for you, right? So not Jimmy, who is your colleague, but someone who's trained and who knows how to do focus groups, that is trusted by those those folks, or this is where you tap somebody from the outside to come in and run your focus group for you, so that there isn't this worry that you would misuse the information. Another thing that we do is that we house any kind of data we do with people on our own Qualtrics server. We actually don't house anything internal to the organization. So that could be another option for you when you bring on that trusted third party or someone else, house the data and the information on their servers. And so it's just another level of creating small steps towards rebuilding your trust. So I hope that was helpful.